wait 5 minutes for them to come and then we'll start. This is basically just to learn what other people have to say. So just bear in mind, and I know these things get heated, I mean, especially over issues of whether you can use your solar panels or not. Some people are getting quite scared, and when they do that, they get a bit angry and they start shouting, and who can blame them, really? They don't know what's going on yet. But we're actually, no one here wrote this plan, and no one's responsible for it, so yelling at someone else in here is a complete waste of time. Where you should yell is in your submission. So I want you all to actually submit something, go onto the council plan site and ring customer service if you need to and get them to find it for you, and put in a submission and speak to your submission. Because if you have, for example, photographic examples of what you're writing, then you can put that out, and it's better for the councillors and the commissioning committee to understand you if that happens. And the more of us do this, the more they realise actually it matters to more than just a few people. So that's extremely important.
Excuse me, what happened to the submission for the close?
They were due to close on the 19th of September, and the week after I ran the first meeting here, the council ran another meeting in the Trafalgar Centre and announced there they put it off until the end of October. So it's 4 p.m, the 31st of October. Okay? That's good. Okay, so, and also I've got quite a broad range of opinions, actually, of architects to speak. So we're not going to all agree with each other. It's just not going to happen. So we don't have to talk each other into anything. What we have to do is talk this council into something different. So you must write it down, even if no one else agrees with you. Okay, right, so a bit about me. So my background actually is in education, is in business and commerce. And I worked in Auckland for a while doing marketing for multinational corporations, and came down here because it's such a better way of life than the one I was living in Auckland. So from here, actually, I also had changed careers. I've done quite a bit in interior design, which is why I've sort of ended up knowing a little bit more about housing and what to say. And I've done a few things. That are more in the public domain. I actually belonged to the Association for the Study of Peak Oil, which is ASPO, a long time ago, when oil first started going out of control with its price. Been involved in transition towns, which is obviously about 15 years ago. And I've also done a few public things with Uniquely Nelson and the Farmers Market. So I've had a fairly broad cross-section of society and what I've been doing in my life. So today I was going to get you just to think, not about actual submissions. Oh, by the way, if you need to follow something, I've wrote down everybody's opinions that I got from the Trafalgar Centre meeting in here, and put them in what to say in your submissions. So that's on my Facebook page, and you're welcome to copy and paste and use that as you will if you're not sure what to say. And it's also in Save Nelson City Facebook page and Stop Plan 29 Facebook page. If you're not a Facebook fan, you're welcome to just contact me. My phone number is at the bottom of the flyer, and we can exchange emails directly. Sorry, Deb?
I remember you said something at the Trafalgar Centre talk. When you do the submission, you have to say, I rebut it and stop.
Oh, yes. Yes. Amazing what you learn when you start talking to people. So one of the ex-council planners said, start off by saying I either accept or reject this plan 100% in its entirety. But if you're going to go ahead with it, I would like to mention the following points. And apparently the story is that if they get the submissions and they decide to have further consultation or whatever happens next, you only get to talk more about the things you mentioned. And if they come up with 4 or 5 different things that we haven't talked about until now, you can't talk about that because you didn't put it down in your original submission. But if you reject it entirely and then mention extras, 100% in its entirety, you get 100% access to further conversations on the submission. Who knew? So today, actually, it's more about housing and the thinking about what we can have. Okay, so we've got a broad opinions here, ranging from very small to international, from ideas from a suburban Nelson single infill to information about international and Northern Hemisphere trends and how they could be applied to New Zealand. So I'd like you to think about actually what does Nelson City need? What would you like? And who are we as a city? And how similar do we want to be for the rest of the world? And as a marketer, just taking tourism as the one example, which I'll use throughout when I'm talking to you, how do you have a point of difference in Nelson to keep its attraction for the tourists? That's extremely important. Okay. Right, so hold on, just get the screen started. So, for example, Arrowtown. So if you're in Queenstown, it's a big city, and you know how it is. It's often in the news. But what did poor old tiny little village Arrowtown do? So they actually pulled out their point of difference as their historical gold mining era. And what they did there, the council actually got organised some photos, I will show you in a second actually, and they insisted that schist be part of the frontage of all the new buildings that went in. So the whole township or city actually has a certain feel about it, and it's really charming. And they really actually milk that for all it's worth, and it's worked really well for them. I'll just show you a couple. I just need to move in and out because I've got an older machine that doesn't sort of scroll properly. So that's a new one, as you can see, but it has the stone in it, so it has a feel that is an ambience about Arrowtown as well. And that's same thing, but this is also new, but it has a much more traditional feel. So what could we do with Nelson? I mean, we don't have a lot of schist, but, you know, it's, for example, actually, the heritage people actually really like the Victorian feel around town. So we have more of those buildings here, apparently, than a lot of other places. So do we look at sort of things along those lines? So another one example is the BNZ building in Auckland. I don't know if you remember this, but in the 80s when I first got up there was a massive hue and cry. They were putting up majorly large, tall buildings everywhere. And the BNZ had a beautiful frontage. So what they did was, in the end, is they kept the 3-storey frontage and they moved back a bit and they put up their massive multi-storey mirrored high-rise behind it. But down at street level, when you're standing at the pedestrian lights waiting to cross the road, you've got this lovely, beautiful stone facade of the Palladian columns and wide steps. And you can just see the mirrored building behind it. So it would have been lovely to have done that with a lot of the buildings around town in the past that actually have lost their facades as well as the actual older buildings. For example, I don't know how many of you remember when the Trathans building had to come down because of earthquake strengthening, and there was a fair bit of discussion about keeping it and getting rid of it. And in the end, actually, I don't think there was a good amalgamation of cooperation between several parties, and they just put up a new building. So we lost that. So what could we do instead? You know, and I don't know that this is even mentioned in the plan. So perhaps you want to ask about that. And so another thing, actually, this is up the very top of Collingwood Street, just before you start actually walking up the Grampians on the gravel path. And the person who built this loved the Collingwood Street area, really liked that area of town, loved the feel of it, really wanted to live here. And that's what he built. A massive gate. suitable more for the Berlin Wall, I would have thought, than Collingwood Street, but what do I know? And so far he's been very lucky. He hasn't had any graffiti put over it, but that's because he's rich enough to afford a camera, so that anybody who does try that gets caught in the process. So can you imagine tourists coming in from Nelson CBD, walking up Collingwood Street? What if everybody did that either side of Collingwood Street? How would you feel driving into work in the morning, having to go down that racetrack? How much graffiti would end up in all of them if they couldn't afford their own cameras? Just it's things like that. Actually, I don't think gates were even mentioned in the plan. So there's a lot more to what we're talking about than just the specifics of the plan. So this is the sort of thing I wanted you to talk about, think about. Okay. No. So in the plan. And they've got the map where the 3 and the 6 story buildings are going, and they're different colours from pale yellow through to sort of a deep orange. They're really just a shape, they're a block, because for a planner, it's the block, it's the dimensions that they're talking about. And after that, they don't really care what happens. So it could be the Betts building they're looking at, or it could be Art Deco up in Allen Street. Or it could be Victorian, as I've mentioned, around Brougham Street. Or it could be a Californian bungalow, which are all over town. It's not specific enough. And the most significant thing I've noticed with talking to people is that we, the public, and I know not all of you are public, but we just talk about how it looks at the end. And these guys, they don't care. It looks the same to them. A rectangular box covers what they're thinking about. So it's really important to realise when you're actually putting a submission in that actually you differentiate between the two, and possibly go to customer service, or they have friends of the submitters, Emily Bayliss, who can have a chat to you about the difference of that. There's a lot more to learn than just what we're talking about. So I thought that was important, especially if you're a heritage lover and that is actually what you're trying to submit on. It's a bit different to what happened in Arrowtown. So in Christchurch, actually, they had another idea after the earthquake. Right. So this is a box too. But as you can see, it's got verandas, it's got specific style windows. It's drawn in a way that they've referred to it as cottage style, but it could easily be turned into something Victorian or Neo-Georgian or whatever. And they are a little bit more charming. So if you're a heritage person or you're a tourist and you're looking at the heritage of New Zealand, these actually are much more pleasant to walk past. And you'll notice actually that the drawing is for several on one section. So you can actually make them look nice, or you can make them look heritage, or you can have the Betts building. So it's just a matter when you're submitting actually to decide quite clearly what it is you're about. People with those concrete Art Deco buildings up in Allen Street, they were built in a specific period, and they're not going to last several hundred years. So if we're looking at one of those and you want that more in your neighbourhood or to retain that, have a think about that as well. I did on the submission form, so if you're interested in putting more about that, have a read of that on my Facebook page or email me and I'll send you a copy. So these are more cottage style, a bit more similar to what we have in South Street. But also, again, as you can see, there are multiple buildings on one site, but they're only 2 stories and they're not going to change the character of your area a lot. So these are 4 houses, and they're on the corner. Hello, what happened here? Little shut. Oh well, never mind. As you can see, I'm not so used to doing this. But these are actually 4 houses on one site too, and they're low and they're single story. And this is the corner of Tota and Vanguard. So this is what you can do without having to go to 3 to 6 stories, and this is zoned for that. It's that area. So these are the sorts of things we could do instead if we asked for it. Yes.
Janet,
Yep.
you mentioned Arrowtown. I'm not sure if everyone's aware, but the Queenstown Lakes District Council is doing a similar change to what we've got. And they're proposing that 12-metre high buildings can be put in Arrowtown in some of this historic area.
So,
Those beautiful photos you showed of Arrowtown, if the residents don't fight the District Council, they could lose it all.
same as going on all over New Zealand, yeah. But I'm a bit myopic. I really only care about Nelson. And the last one, this is Peter Olorenshaw, we're getting up talking last. Ah, rats. So the best part's actually washed itself out. Excellent. My apologies for that. We did try to find a larger venue actually with a projector screen, but unfortunately it was too short notice, or some of them didn't even reply, so we ended up back here again, so I'm sorry if it's not perfect. But I can actually put that up on my Facebook page, or you can contact me and I can email it to you. But basically he's got two houses on the same section, and the roof actually goes right out to the fence line, but it drops significantly the whole way, so it doesn't affect your sunlight angles. I've never seen houses like this anywhere. And he has a house at the back and the house at the front, and they share a driveway, but it runs through the centre. So it's just, you can get some very different ideas if you start asking architects what they can do.
Just going back to the corner of Vanguard and Torture Street before, and that's good quality rental that was developed there. The developer, the council wanted them to go 2 levels, but they wouldn't because of the cost.
Yes, I can imagine. Yes. So yes, cost is always an issue. And in a capitalist society, there's never enough of that.
But my point being, the cost is going to dictate what happens. It doesn't matter though, if you're zoned and you've got a section next to you that's vacant forever, it's still going to potentially ruin where you live, but
yes.
potential for development.
Yeah, so cost is an issue, that's true. Yes, but actually cost affects everything all the time, so I just leave that out because it's not something that we can sort of discuss. It's individual things then. Yes. Okay. Right. So the other thing I'd like to mention too is you may want to mention the fact that actually since we first discussed here a month ago that Nelson has now turned out to be a Tier 2 city. And apparently Tier 2 cities, A, don't need to have a change of plan at all, and B, don't necessarily need to include 3 to 6 stories. So you could put in your submission that you want to chuck it out in its entirety because it doesn't fit in with Tier 2, and mention that as a result also. But the thing to do, the other thing about you making your submission and about the kinds of houses you like, etc., and the things that people talk to me about are these sort of end results, is you want to make that decision about what kind of Nelson you need or what kind of Nelson you want. And one sort of, they have apparently been discussing this plan off and on differently for about 10 years, but I don't blame anybody for not keeping track of that for the last 10 years. So this is why these things have all come up now, and it feels a bit backward. However, okay, so I've got 4 speakers. And the first is going to be Mark Fielding, who's a licensed architectural designer. So I just let them all just have their say and speak. And then once they've finished, actually we'll get up and we'll have questions and answers from the floor and statements, and we can start talking about whatever other knowledge is in the room, and people can talk to that. But just let them just go through their presentation. Okay, so Mark's been here since 1980s, so he's had over 30 years here, and he's been a director of his own company here for 30 years. And he runs a company called Ecotect Ltd, which has done well over residential building projects. He's done well over 2,000, and he's done them for other people as well. Not just here in Nelson and Tasman, but the whole of New Zealand. He's had multiple awards for local design. So he's going to talk about a secondary minor dwelling, and this is an alternative solution for him. Okay, Mark, would you like to stand up? Okay.
Thanks very much, Jan. And look, if it wasn't for Jan organising this first meeting a month ago, we wouldn't have had the public meeting at the Trafalgar Centre, we wouldn't have had front page news in the Nelson Mail, and we wouldn't have had an extension to the submission period. So can we have a round of applause for Jan? So, yeah, I'm going to speak about secondary minor dwellings. That's my alternative solution to the Plan Change 29. What you're seeing on the screen is Auckland City Council's unitary plan guidelines for secondary minor dwellings. Came out about 2016. Still had quite restrictive planning rules on it, but I'm suggesting something similar for Nelson, even though the city councils have considered it. I'll read from my notes if you don't mind, because there's a lot to go through. So I don't like the premise of Plan Change 29 to go upward. I think we can go inward. So my proposal to alleviate potential population growth, if that's a thing, and housing needs as an alternative solution to Plan Change 29 is to maximise and promote secondary minor dwellings on existing residential properties. Now, while commonly called granny flats, such dwellings can provide affordable housing solutions for single persons, young couples and small families, as well as us ageing grandparents. I myself live in 15 square metre a studio apartment under my house, with my son's family occupying the house above. So now, while infill development is part of the proposals of the Plan Change 29, and of course while such development's been an ongoing strategy with builders and developers for years, decades, it's still quite difficult to get one of these things through the planning process. So the Auckland plan, as you see on the screen there, and there's going to be more examples that I've come up with since then. I was involved with a team in Nelson, including a manufacturer, structural engineer, students and tutors from NMIT, and myself as designer, for a design competition held by Auckland City Council and a group called Prefab New Zealand about 5-6 years ago. We didn't win anything, failed to make the 12 winners, perhaps because we were focused on practicality and affordability rather than architectural style. But it got me really excited about this type of housing model. And I sent letters to Nelson City Council, Tasman District Council at the time, asking if this was a possible thing that they could do. TDC did reply to me and say they were looking at introducing it to suburbs, the older suburbs of Richmond, but that each application would still need a resource consent and development contribution levies, and they were a bit vague on what rates would be increased and so forth. Nelson City Council made no response at all. So I'm arguing for the Plan Change 29 to be thrown out, except for allowing secondary minor dwellings, and one other thing I'll get to in a minute. Number one, no change to daylight controls. Now, obviously there's massive change to daylight controls in the Plan Change 29. These daylight controls effectively protect neighbours from new developments blocking their daylight admission, and I'm sure all of you agree with that. What you don't know about Plan Change 29, it eliminates the road boundary daylight control, which protects shading from footpaths and roads. So that's gone. As designers, we have to account for that when we're designing a house. And also, they seem to have ditched the daylight around control, which works on steep sites where the daylight over control just doesn't work. As in my own place, actually. I live on a 1 and 3 grade section. So number two, no change to yard setbacks. Now at present, anyone can build right up to the boundary, as we've seen a few times, provided that the daylight controls are maintained and that a fire-rated wall is constructed within 1 metre of the boundary. Plan Change 29 provides for a 1 metre setback to all properties and 1.5 metres from the street. Number three, change to a 50% site coverage as per Plan Change 29. That's the only other change I'm advocating for. This will allow easing for the implementation of additional minor dwellings that I'm proposing. And it would be limited only to the sites that currently have a 40% site coverage, not the higher density areas like the Wood, which have 30 metres squared site coverage, which can be raised to 33% with a discretionary resource consent. Number 4, no change to existing car park requirements. We all have cars and we don't want to park them on the street, thank you very much. And I'm also advocating for 1 new extra car park for each additional secondary minor dwelling. But all these new car parks and existing car parks, if there's no building on them, then that doesn't get included in site coverage, because at the moment it does. Or at least 2 of them get included in site coverage, even if there's no garage or building on that car park space. Number 5, a suggestion that a resource consent is not required for the bulk and location requirements, or actually just for putting a secondary minor dwelling on the site, as long as the bulk and location requirements are not breached. But if you do want to breach those, maybe by going a bit closer, breaching daylight controls, for example, then I would advocate that neighbours' consent should be asked for a resource consent for a small breach in the bulk and location requirements, because that seems to have been relaxed in recent years in my experience, and I don't think that's fair. If you're going to do a resource consent, you need to ask the neighbours if they can consent to it. Number 6, no increase in rates because they're based on land value. But of course, not the whole thing on a rates bill is part and parcel of the land value. There's all the sewer rate and the water rate and everything else. So if the council decided, they probably could say, well, your half, you pay rates yourself, and then the existing half pay rates. So there's bound to be an increase a little bit in rates. Number 7, I agree for the acceptability of a contribution to infrastructure development, because another building is going to put pressure on drains and services and perhaps roads in a few places too. But maybe $5,000 as a flat fee is enough for that. It's a small amount in comparison to the whole cost. So number 8, building sizes can be between 30 square metres and 60 square metres. That's similar to the Auckland Unitary Plan that they had in mind. Number 9, the secondary minor dwelling would not only cater for increasing population, regardless of whether those statistical predictions are accurate, but mainly will provide for truly affordable housing, which doesn't seem to be addressed in this plan change at all, in my view. They think that $600,000 is affordable. Well, not in my world. I'm talking much lower than that. Now, this is especially for young growing families that otherwise would find it impossible to get on the house ownership ladder. My son is 39 years old. His wife and kids, they haven't a hope of getting on the home ownership ladder. Number 10, potential building costs for smaller, simple dwellings could be as low as $50,000 for a 30 square metre unit, and maybe up to or a little bit more than $150,000 for a 60 square metre 2-bedroom secondary minor dwelling. And if it was prefabricated or off-site built, that could also reduce costs, and it would definitely reduce timeframes, which also reduce costs, because then you're not paying money in rent while you're waiting for the new building to be built. Number 11, usage not restricted to family members. This is what I'm advocating for a secondary minor dwelling. Doesn't have to be just for a granny flat for family members. It could also be rented out for an income stream. But it shouldn't be allowed to be sold on the property, and not be permitted to be subdivided at some future date. So current proposals for such applications that I've actually tried myself in recent years all require a resource consent and are subject to analysis by planning staff who consider that if the proposal was built, it would need to meet future subdivision rules. Now, this has no logic in my mind at all. When a current proposal would work fine as presented on the same property, but they would say it's declined because it's not possible to subdivide at some future date. Surely the owner can take responsibility for that and say, I don't want it to be subdivided, and tough for anybody that wants to in the future. That just makes sense to me. Number 12, construction would be limited to piled foundations for future potential removal or replacement of the building. This would allow for subsequent owners, if they wanted their garden back or wanted to put in a pool, they could remove the unit quite easily. It also allows for the seller of the whole property to remove the building for use on their next property, or they might want to sell it as a profit separate from the sale of the whole property, because that might maximise a higher sale price. Number 13, small to medium construction companies could spring up around town to cater for this growing trend, just as they have for the tiny house movement. Now, I was listening to the radio this morning, RNZ 7:30 AM, and they had a whole article on the tiny house movement, and a lot of those companies are going bust actually, mainly because COVID just did in their businesses. But what does that say? There was 10,000 people at a tiny house forum in Auckland recently. 10,000 people came up, and a few years ago there was 70 people that came to that forum. So tiny houses could be included as a secondary minor dwelling on an existing residential site as long as it met daylight controls and as long as it was connected to services like sewer pipes. But even if it couldn't be, a lot of the infrastructure in Nelson doesn't provide for an extra sewer connection for another dwelling. There might be up to 6 or 7 houses already on a 100mm diameter sewer pipe. So in that case, then there should be provisions for composting toilets or biodigesters to allow for an alternative way of disposing with waste. Number 14. This solution's perfect for young families, either renting or wanting to own, and perhaps the banks could allow a 10% deposit for such buildings. But either way, a deposit might be as low as $15,000 for a bank loan. And maybe the council could guarantee such loans. Fat chance. Number 15, the plans on the screen are for modular prefabricated building system. These were some of the ones that we put in for the design competition. The studio apartment at 32 square metres, a 1-bedroom unit at 43 square metres, and which is that one. And also, you could add on to it a bit for 47 square metres, a 2-bedroom unit 56 square metres, and a different 2-bedroom unit at 60 square metres. These are just some examples for possible designs, and I actually already work for a building company that makes prefabricated cabins and small houses in Nelson, and they're very cheap, even when I get involved and make sure they comply with the building code, which they don't when they're sold for use without a consent under Schedule 1 of the Building Act. Any building under 30 square metres can be used as a sleep out without a building consent, but it can't have plumbing in it or any other kind of services really. I'll try and get this through. I'm on the last page now. Number 16, such modular designs can be adopted like these ones on a 1.2 metre grid, so that at some point in the future you might be able to add on to them if there's room on the site. So that's another cost saving. And while perhaps these designs are not suitable for a family with older kids, for obvious reasons, you're just too crammed in, but these solutions could still adequately house young families for at least 5 years, and by that time, after having paid low mortgages or rent costs, and maybe then they sell the building for a profit, they could have enough after 5 years for a deposit on a larger house somewhere else in town. So that works. Number 17, the government through MB allows for a multi-proof consenting system whereby a building company might sell several small buildings a year like these ones. They can apply to MB for a building consent for those plans. It's called a multi-proof building consent. And then when they apply for a council consent, the council only have to check planning rule adherence, ground strength and service connections. They must process this within 10 working days as opposed to 20 working days, which is currently, that's a month basically, for a consent application. And then there's another month after that while you sort out the issues. So, you know, that could save money as well, being a cheaper consent application if it's a multi-proof from a building company that has a multi-proof system. Number 18, smaller homes are easier to heat. And the new H1 energy efficiency requirements in the building code, which came out earlier this year, can then easily be met at the design stage. Now this leads to lower heating bills, and of course also these homes have lower maintenance costs because they're brand new. Number 19, these light timber frame homes are using local materials like naturally durable New Zealand grown timber weatherboards. They have a lower embodied energy than a large permanent steel and concrete tower block, which also have higher heating costs because of overuse of concrete. So local materials, lower embodied energy, easier to build. Number 20, and this is a big one. So this proposal could add between 2 and 4 additional beds per property. That's if you count a double bed as 2 beds. And that's for sections over, say, 400 square metres where a secondary minor dwelling with enough space on the property could be built within the bulk and location requirements in the district plan. So let's conservatively estimate that half the residential properties in Nelson that currently have a 40% site coverage rule, that could be, say, 10,000 households, can add an average of 3 beds per site. So that's somewhere between a studio apartment and a 2-bedroom apartment, secondary minor dwelling. So that totals 10,000 times 3, 30,000 new beds. Now to put that in context, Nelson population in 2020 was 52,900. So this proposal that I'm suggesting could effectively provide a 50% rise in population within a few years. So think about that. Maybe we don't need all this other development going up and out and everywhere. Because number 21, my message is simple. Keep the existing rules apart from a 10% increase in site coverage and to allow secondary minor dwellings without a resource consent. Maintain the existing character of Nelson, which is why I came here to live, as we don't want it looking like Christchurch, Auckland or Wellington, thank you very much. Well, I certainly don't. Use existing properties to sensitively increase bed numbers with low profile, small, lightweight, removable dwellings that are priced to allow young people, or old like me, to buy them or rent them. This will address both the population increase concerns, whether accurate or not, and most of all address true affordability, and also addressing sustainable building methods. So thank you very much.
Okay. All right, thank you, Mark. So, yes, a bit different from my ideas.
That's why everyone's different.
Yes. So the next person up is Lindsay Wood, who has also been here for a long time. He's a registered architect, but now he runs a climate strategy company called Resilienz. So he's coming at this from a different perspective yet again. So he's going to talk about the big picture around the plan and alternative processes to the current plan. Okay, so his experience is actually he's learned in Europe, and he's going to show some examples of higher density housing. So this is moving a step away again in a different direction. So I'll let him just set his computer up, and I'll hand you over to Lindsay. Thank you.
Okay, looks like we're into business. Thank you very much, and great to talk to you. I've got quite a different perspective to Mark. I'm not disagreeing with what he says, but I'm coming from a much more global perspective. I'm going to be talking about a macro view around the world a bit and some very big issues to do with Plan Change 29. I'm going to make a recommendation on the process that we follow, and then I'm going to spend a fair bit of time on my experience in Northern Europe, where there are different examples. I'm not trying to sell you on what they do, I'm just showing some differences. So let's get into it. Low density since the Second World War has happened almost everywhere, largely through the proliferation of the private car. And as a result, the combination of the private car and the low density have meant that civic finances have struggled. Fair Work, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. It's made a big difference to the climate challenge we're facing. I'll talk more about that. And then there's a whole lot of other stuff that I'm not going to talk more about today. Okay, so if we move on from there, I want to start with the climate thing. Plan Change 29 fits into a global imperative to try and tackle this terrible problem of the climate emergency. For example, getting off fossil fuels means that we will reduce, hopefully, trashing places like the boreal forest and getting major tar sand extraction to generate more fuel to help us put more carbon dioxide in the air. And in turn, Plan Change 29 is connected with, for example, as a result of that, reducing some of the awful effects we're having from the climate, which you can see there. I mentioned urban economics. There's a great website in the US called Strong Towns, and this is from one of their studies for a city called Lafayette. Now, and this is to do with moving from medium density to low density and the vice versa. So, I'm sorry, if we look here, there's the Lafayette. Medium density in 1949, they had about 33,500 people. That grew through low density expansion in 2015 to about 121,000. Now, the analysis they've done is pretty interesting. They measured the lengths of pipes per person that the council is managing, sewers and stormwater and that sort of thing. Originally, you probably can't see the number there, but the images tell you there were 5 feet of pipe per person in 1949, and that became 50 feet per person by the time they'd done the low density expansion. In other words, the council was having to look after 10 times as much sewer and stormwater and everything per person that they had to with the medium density they had about 60 or 70 years earlier. If you look at fire hydrants, an unusual measure per 1,000 people, it went up by a factor of 21. So the council had to look after 21 times as many fire hydrants per person. Add in the fact that they've got more roads, they've got more parks and all the rest of it. And there's a great deal of financial burden. And we all know that cities around the country are struggling to keep on top of their infrastructure maintenance. So we have to realise that increasing density is actually a benefit in that area. This is the only other geeky one I'm going to show you. The Building Research Association a few years ago did world-acclaimed research on the carbon footprint of our houses. They did a calculation on what carbon we had available within our economy, and they worked out that we could have 35 tonnes per dwelling as an allowable lifetime carbon for that. Then they analysed a whole lot of dwellings, 10 in this case. The carbon content, the green is the carbon due to actually building the house. The red is the energy, emissions associated with energy, and then the blue is those associated with water, which you don't automatically think have emissions associated with them. The point about that is that every one of the ones they looked at had cleaned out its whole lifetime budget before anybody had even moved into the house. So the point about that is, and this plays back to what Mark was talking about, his little cottages are probably one of the very few examples that will actually come in somewhere near this budget here. It's actually got worse since then, but I won't bore you with those details. So the point there is that in addition to all the other problems, we've got to find a way of building much lower carbon buildings, and Mark's comment was about that. So we need to also talk about timing. I think that's a big thing missing from the conversation, is how much or how little should we be growing over time. We're actually locked into some things there that we might not want to be locked into. How can we do so with genuinely low emissions long term? How do we achieve that if we're going to be compatible with giving our grandkids some sort of future that's half worth having? Intensification is one of the keys. None of us particularly want it near us, but I think one of our challenges is to think, how can we make that happen well? And I'm going to talk a little bit about it. And the core question, I think, is how can we do it in an acceptable way? That's what's not been addressed in the plan, both in terms of the scale of it and the timing of it. I want to talk a little bit about process, and Jan at the beginning talked about the different viewpoints and the heat between people and things like that. Some of you will know of a citizens' assembly or a people's assembly, and I just want to run a little bit about that because it's a wonderful process that's being used increasingly around the world. We have not used it here. I think it's a pity we didn't. But anyway, just a couple of months ago, the government produced a report on the future of local government, and their very first of their recommendations was that there was low public trust in councils, and one way to increase it was to increase the citizens' participation in these decisions. And I'm encouraging people, and I've put a bit of paper out there explaining more, to actually add to their submission that encourage the council to do this. It helps diffuse all the diverse opinions, it gives us better information, and so on. It's not an easy fit with the stage that the Plan Change 29 is at due to the legal processes it's now committed to. But I'm an absolute believer that this would be a way to get to a better result with a lot less friction and so on in the community. Right, now that's me done on the big picture. I'm now jumping into Northern Europe, and this is a little patch in the northeast corner of Hamburg. And for all the world, it looks like a giant army barracks, doesn't it? And you look at that and you think, well, who would want to live there? I've actually know that area quite well. I have lived there. But there, for example, is a street. That picture is taken about here, looking along that direction. And okay, you might not want to live there yourself, but it doesn't look too bad. It certainly doesn't look like an army barracks. Here's a building on the other side, one of the buildings. Now, again, I'm not saying we should be building like this, but there are a few things I want to say about that. One is that that's the apartment that I lived in for some time, and I'll tell you what, it was a damn nice apartment. But the point I really want to say is that this is a bit of a typology that's very often recurring around Europe, and that is 4 stories plus a half basement, and there are different reasons why that works really well. So I'm suggesting that if people are advocating or submitting on the height of buildings, we actually trash the 6th story and say, well, under some circumstances, this may be a good way to go. What are the advantages of that? A half basement is where you lift the lowest floor up half a floor, you go into the ground half a floor, so you've got a full basement. That, first of all, gives you a lot of utility storage and places for services and things. Then it also means that the lowest living floor is 1.5 meters up, so it's got a bit better privacy and it's got a bit better outlook. But the other couple of things that are really good about it is that they're buildings that don't have to have a lift, point 1. And point 2, if you look at, I don't know if you can see on that size, they actually don't dominate the treescape. Those aren't particularly big trees in that picture, but they still are big enough to actually work in with the buildings a bit. So just from a point of view, if we're going to have bigger buildings, let's try and get them right. It's a lot about how we do things as well as what we do. Just out of interest, that's having a picnic with a large group of friends in the garden of this army barracks. So moving on from there, I want to talk a little bit about permeability. That's something we don't do well in higher density developments in New Zealand. We tend to take each site, build it out to the max, and then the next people do. And how does the public get through or walk around? Now you might look, you see these big circular buildings here, or enclosed buildings, are big apartment buildings. It's hard to imagine things like that in New Zealand. But what I want to do is I want to talk to you about permeability, and in particular, you can probably just see that grey line. Sorry, it's a bit wiggly from this angle. That grey line going up there. This is what it looks like if you're looking along that arrow there. So this is the streetscape or the alleyscape through there. It's not a vehicle path. In fact, there are barriers that are hard to see there. There's another of those 4 stories plus a half basement buildings. But the thing I really want to show you is this archway at the end, because in that case, the public walkway goes right through underneath the apartments over the top. So again, if you're going to have multi-storey buildings, especially if they're starting to work right along a block or something like that, there are ways of providing penetration and permeability through it. Here's another one. I know this quite well. I've got some friends that live there. This is actually a private development of 4,500 square metres. That's not a big area. That's about half a dozen residential sections or a little bit more. There are 31 families there. The permeability is that this brown line is a public walkway. That's it there. No vehicles are allowed in. And it's a damn nice place to live. So most of the buildings there are 3-storey. I think there's 1 2-storey and 1 4-storey. But the point is, again, it's a lot about is how we do it as well as what we do.
Sorry, what does permeability mean? What does that actually mean?
Sorry, what was that?
Permeability, what does that mean?
The question is, what does permeability mean? Permeability is the ability for people or bikes or whatever to penetrate through the buildings and get across to somewhere else without having to go away around the block. If we build continuously right along the block, then we make it very hard. The way we do, that tends to be hard. These are just a few quick examples. I think that looks really cool. That's again part of a development right along the street. That's 2 stories plus a roof development. There's 3 stories plus a half basement plus a roof development. Bear in mind, I'm not trying to sell these to you. I'm just saying, look, these are some ways that stuff might happen. But I want you to take notice of this building here, which is 3 stories plus the roof plus a half basement plus a lot of brickwork, and compare it with the one I'm just going to show you on the left there. So that's exactly the same geometry. So again, it's not just about the height, it's about what we do with it and how it's going to finish up. So if we do have higher buildings, and I think we will, and personally I hope we will, in selected places, not in the big blanket way, then let's make sure they're done well. We need some more guidance to achieve that. Let's have a little look at the other side. Oh, great colours coming in there, and some people think, oh, I don't know whether I'd like that. And oh, there are some more great colours, and oh, look at that happens to be Nelson. So, okay, so it's about more than height. Here's another, these are all just 2-storey buildings. So again, it's about how we do things as well as how high we do them. There's another 2-storey, that's almost like the Arrowtown ones that Jan showed. That's not Arrowtown, that's in the Cotswolds in Britain. So again, we have to think, what is it we want to achieve? They're all 2-storey buildings. This is in Hamburg again. The left-hand one is a 6-apartment building. The right-hand one is an 8-apartment building. And I want to talk a little bit about this first, but I just want to say one thing. I've agreed with Mark on the size and the low carbon footprint, but I don't agree with him about energy. And that is that if you have a lot of apartments together butted up against each other, they will generally use a lot less energy than freestanding buildings. However, I want to talk about this. I'm closing now. You see I've headed that, lastly the same, only different. That's a building in Hamburg that about 4 or 5 decades ago was derelict. It was occupied by squatters. It was scheduled for demolition. And in fact, it was the locals that stood up and said, we don't want this demolished, we value it. And it's now a very much valued community building. And you think, well, who would protect that? We have another story like that in Nelson. It's very close to where we are. In fact, it's the building we're in right now. About 4 decades ago, it was pretty well derelict. It was occupied by squatters. The story goes on in the same story. So where we are is let's try and see Plan Change 29, see its problems as opportunities rather than just things we've got to stop, and let's see that's how we look at them that's important. And how do we look at that? Just do nothing, it's impossible, or we can say, just do it. Nothing is impossible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lindsay. Very clever. Okay, so next person I've got standing to speak is William Samuels. He has his own architect business, and he's actually the chair of the Nelson Branch of the New Zealand Institute of Architects. Okay, so and he's also the co-founder of the Nelson Tasman 2050, so he's been involved in this for a wee while. He's talking about intensification in New Zealand, what works and what doesn't, and which is a different subject to the building's appearance, but they can be incorporated. So he's just going to set up his little system, and he'll be with you in a couple of minutes. Oh, there was one other thing someone said to me earlier, which I thought was quite clever. They said that Nelson's one of the sunniest places in New Zealand. In fact, when you compare it to places in Northern Europe, it's possibly one of the sunniest places that they've ever known in the world. He says, no one calls it daylight, Nelson, do they? So I thought we should consider that, because actually that's part of the reason why people come here. We have a lot more sunlight than a lot of places. Okay, William.
Righty.
I want to lift this a bit. Do you want to adjust that?
Oh, I'm fine.
That's all
Thanks.
right.
Alrighty, can you all hear me? We're good? Excellent. All right, so thank you for inviting me along here. It's good to be involved. As Jan said, I am a local architect. I'm the chair of the Nelson Branch of the Institute of Architects. I'm also co-founder of Nelson Tasman 2050, and that is a urban design and housing advocacy body. We've been doing a lot of work in that space for the last couple of years. And really at the core of that is this question, like what does good quality intensification look like? And I think that's a question we have to be asking ourselves. I think that there is a difference between intensification and good quality intensification, right? And New Zealand does not do intensification well. We are absolutely crap at it. I'm sorry, I come from the architect industry, I should be supporting architects, but we are really bad at it. And we are at a point now, the history of New Zealand, where we're having to make some pretty fundamental shifts in how we build and design, right? And that's not just Nelson, that's throughout the country, and there's lots of different reasons for that. I won't get really into all those reasons because it's, take me several hours to get through those. But the point is we're at this point that we're now starting to have to think about how do we change how we build and grow? How do we supply housing? And so a lot of the work that I've been doing in that space is to ask, well, how do we ensure that we get good quality intensification? A, what does that look like? But B, how do we then get that? And for Nelson in particular, that's really significant. So I've been speaking a lot, both locally and at a national level, and engaging with councils to discuss that process and to ask, and also events like this, community groups to talk through what does good quality intensification look like and how can we really harness that. When we talk about intensification, what I'm trying to advocate for here is good quality design. And when we look even just at what Jan was talking about at the beginnings with those examples, what was really apparent with those is that the critical factor in all of those images she showed is good quality design. I think you could take any building, locally, internationally, and if you have a poor design or a good design, that's critical, And so I think the problem we have locally is that there aren't the qualitative controls that we need to ensure good quality design outcomes. And I want to ask the question, who is designing our cities? At the moment, no one's really designing our cities. And that's true of New Zealand. And in other countries throughout the world, there are actual design parameters in place to ensure good quality design outcomes, and there is a vision for the city. In New Zealand, very few councils do that. Nelson City Council is not one of those councils. And so what that means is that the design of our cities is left up to developers. It's left up to developers and it's left up to homeowners, and it's not done on a city-wide basis, it's not done on a neighbourhood basis, it's done on a site-by-site basis. And what we end up with is uncoordinated, poor design, with poor amenity, poor impact on the streetscape, and nothing that increases the value and the quality and the amenity and the livability of our cities. And so I think that when I'm speaking about Plan Change 29, I'm sort of taking a step back from some of these more minute details about number of stories or setbacks or anything like that. I wanted to actually just get us all to take a step back and say, what do we want in terms of the design of our cities? And what is the process that we need to go through to get to that? So with Plan Change 29, just wanted to touch on a couple of things of what's working, what I think is not really working. So the first is the intent. Now, I actually really support the intent of intensification because for some of the comments that Lindsay said, in New Zealand, we sprawl. That's what we love. We just, see green space or farms and we just say, let's chuck some houses there. Well, that's what we do. And we do need to try and intensify. And in Nelson in particular, you just walk down the street and you look at all the shops which are closing down and the businesses which are going under. And the vibrancy, which I grew up in Nelson. I remember being here as a kid in the early 90s, and it was just this life in Nelson. And I think it's being sucked away because all the investment that we have is going out past Richmond. We need people in the city. We need intensification. The problem I have with this is I think the process that Council's gone through is not quite right or wrong. And for a couple of reasons. I think that the first one is the community engagement wasn't there. And the second one is that I think that there is a fairly one-size-fits-all approach to intensification. And in the future development strategy that was released in 2022, there was a requirement for neighbourhood and block level spatial plans to be undertaken prior to any intensification plan change. And I think that has been absolutely missed from the process. And that is a process which will allow us to look at individual neighbourhoods and say, what is the type of design that we want here? What is the type of built outcome that we need? And then apply specific plan changes that work in that area. And that then alleviates a lot of the concerns that people have about this, and it also, by creating a plan and actually having a designed outcome, we have a vision for a neighbourhood. I don't know how many people here can actually go into their neighbourhood and say, this is what this is going to look like in 50 years' time. I don't think any of us can, right? But we need that because things do change and we need to make sure that when they change, they happen in a good, positive way. And when the initial reaction when we look at change or something like Plan Change 29 is to say, we don't want that, we don't want any change, we want it to be the same. Change is happening. It's an inevitability, and there will be development, there will be building in Nelson. But the key here is actually to really look, how can we harness that and how can we get a better outcome than what we have now? So I think that's a fundamental. And then the third one is just the standards that have been proposed. And so I think, again, there's a couple of issues there. The key one is that I do not believe there are qualitative standards or controls in place which would ensure good quality outcome. I think what's in the plan change, and this is true not just locally but at national level with the medium density residential standards, is they are quantitative. They're all about the number of units being put on a site, they're about site coverage and things, but they're not about the quality of design outcomes that happen. Now, I think that if a really well-designed building crops up in a neighbourhood, it's something that generally we can get on board with because it thinks through those impacts to the neighbours. It thinks through its impact on the street, its green space and so forth. But there's nothing which is making that a requirement in the plan change. There's nothing nationally which ensures those qualitative standards. The other thing is the delivery strategy of this, which I'll touch on briefly. So intensification New Zealand, as I said, we don't do it well. We do this. And this for me is something that I find heartbreaking that the newest suburb in Nelson is named after the thing that it destroyed to be built. I met some people last night who were saying that they would come up every year from Christchurch to go berry picking in Nelson. What is our identity as a city, right? That's part of our identity, and now that's gone. This is the reason why we need to rethink how we're building. And it's just, we sprawl. We do these low-rise subdivisions, and it's all the same type of thing. There's no diversity in housing typology. There's For younger people to get onto the housing ladder, they have to buy a 3 or 4 bedroom house way out in the suburbs, and it also is really disconnecting from communities. This is intensification, how we currently do this, and I think this is where I'm going to diverge from Mark's comments earlier. I actually disagree with backyard intensification or infill intensification as a legitimate long-term strategy for how we get more housing, because it is, I think, a short-term fix, and it doesn't increase the value or increase the design outcomes that we have in our neighbourhood. It doesn't increase the amenity, and the risks with it is that we lose green space, we lose outlook, we fracturing our blocks to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And actually, one of the comments in one of the items in the plan change is to reduce the minimum subdivision size, which means we can fracture these blocks further and further and further. But there is, at a certain point, that gets saturated. We can't do that anymore. And there's areas of Nelson which is 100% saturated. We cannot further fracture that stuff anymore. And what we end up happening is that people are looking into each other's backyards. I understand people's concerns about daylighting, but you actually are not really addressing it with this type of low-rise backyard infill, because you actually end up with just as many shadows being cast. This is probably the end outcome of low-rise intensification in New Zealand, is the sausage flat, which is because we have these long, thin sites, which are, there used to be a single house, a nice big quarter-acre backyard. In New Zealand, we build these, and they are atrocious. They look at each other's backyards. They have no privacy. They remove all of the green space. You have kids in there whose experience of an outdoor space is their driveway. And that is what we do in New Zealand. We need to rethink that. This is a sausage flat typology, which is the previous one there. And so basically on the left, what we've got is this is being designed within the recession plane. So it's come in from the edges of the site, right? And it's at a certain height, so that it fits within that building envelope that council tells us. And so that envelope is there for overshadowing, right? But the problem with that is that this is the natural design that comes out of that building envelope. And then you look onto each other's backyards, you have no green space, and then the next neighbour does, and so forth, and you get some pretty awful outcomes. Now, a pretty quick switch you can make is actually to direct inwards and outwards within your site. And the good thing about that is that you get outlook to both directions, and you consolidate the green space, and so you have a really decent garden out the back. So this is something known as a pyramid block typology. Now, I've got some examples of this, and I don't necessarily pitch this as saying this is a solution for housing in Nelson. What I would say is that this is an approach which is can be designed into a neighbourhood spatial plan, and that at the moment there is nothing which directs development into a particular type or typology or anything like that. And we need to have more controls in place to, a plan which understands what the outcomes are that we're after, and B, direction and controls which ensure that that's what happens. So this is Melbourne. This is that pyramid block typology. I lived many years in Melbourne. I worked there, and I lived in these, and they are awesome. They're street facing. They have some really generous backyards out the back. But what's interesting about these is that the concerns about sunlight aren't actually that much of a concern anymore, because the way that they're designed is so that their orientation of living spaces at either end ensures adequate daylight, and also it means that as a wider urban form, you're not struggling with your neighbour overshadowing into your backyard, because everyone has the same backyard, and that backyard has plenty of space. So that's actually a really good typology. This is someone's backyard in Melbourne. And as I say, I'm not pushing this as being a design outcome for a particular space, but it is something that I think we can consider. And this is an example of where a well-designed or well-thought-through typology addresses some of the concerns which are, I think, legitimate that people have regarding heights and daylighting setbacks, right? Other examples, so similar to Lindsay's one, got one in London here, which is, I think, 4 stories, and then the one on the right here, again, that's 4 stories. That's actually not that scary if it's done in a manner which is well-designed and cohesive. The problem we have, here's some from Christchurch and Auckland as well, similar type of things, and this is unbelievably washed out, so I apologise with that, but the problem we have is how do we get somewhere like that? And so again, this is my point, that in New Zealand, there is no cohesive strategy for how we design our cities. So the top, let's say roughly that's where we're at the moment, and the bottom is something, this is your terraced housing you might have in Melbourne or so forth. Getting from the top to the bottom, really problematic, right? Because you have a developer who says, all right, we're going to chuck these ones here in this site, and then you've got the neighbour on the south there who says, well, hold up, you know, this is really problematic. So the real challenge we have here is this middle image here is how we intensify. We do it on a site-by-site basis. So what I'm pitching is actually the idea of these really robust neighbourhood and block level spatial plans and delivery strategies that are able to ensure that that development is done in a way that is properly considerate of neighbourhood amenity and long-term goals for how a neighbourhood looks. So really it's about design-led solutions, right? Rather than developer-led solutions, which is what we have currently. One thing I pitched to council last year, and they're actually undertaking a feasibility study on, is the idea of a Nelson Tasman Urban Development Agency. Urban development agencies are entities which are quite common overseas. There's 1 or 2 in New Zealand, and the idea is that it's an independent organisation that is involved in the design and planning of particular areas, but also the facilitation of development. And so what that means is that they would work with the private sector and say, we have this area of town which is a bit run down. You know, we don't want to just say everyone do their own thing, but let's come up with some strategies to develop this in a manner which is cohesive and to get some really good design outcomes. So that's a really good vessel that's currently, as I say, the feasibility study is underway, and I would really strongly back that. I'm sort of restraining from saying 100% support that, because it depends on what council comes out of their feasibility study and what format they propose for that. But I think the idea is very sound. So I do just have a couple of closing comments about how I think Plan Change 29 could be improved. And I do say this because I understand, I hear what people are saying about wholeheartedly rejecting Plan Change 29, and I completely understand the rationale behind that. But given the nature of where we're at currently and the fact that things are going to change locally, we do know that there is going to be development, there is going to be growth, and we do need to accept that and understand that and work with that. I would actually suggest that we move it more towards, instead of a complete rejection, but an improvement of it, and ask how can we harness this process to get better outcomes. There's always going to be challenges thrown up when things change. The key to it is to harness that and try and actually get some better outcomes. I think we could do that. So firstly is neighbourhood and block level spatial plans, right? Individual neighbourhoods, streets, it's all different. Nelson has such a wide variety in terms of topography, in terms of block size, in terms of character, the nature of houses, the density. It's really difficult to try and do a single one-size-fits-all design for that. We need to be doing that on a more robust, rigorous basis. Secondly, that's a long process to do it properly. So I think what we should be doing is incrementally planning for particular neighbourhoods. Start with the low-hanging fruit first, the easy pickings, the ones that we know we want to focus on, and then incrementally release those plan changes as they're designed. Thirdly, get community and design industry engagement with the process. I think we're all feeling a little bit caught out, and as Jan said, this is a process that has been going on for 10 years, but yeah, there's I think there's a multitude of issues as to why it's taken 10 years and why we're at this position we're at now. But I feel like we're all feeling a little bit caught out because it felt like council hasn't consulted or hasn't properly engaged. So I think that's a really key aspect. Fourthly, I would suggest establishing an urban development agency. If we have proper block level spatial plans, we need a delivery strategy, and we need a way to do that in a cohesive manner and to get the private sector engaged, and so I would suggest having an urban development agency doing that. Fifthly, ensure strong qualitative standards are put in place. So that is about the quality of the design outcome. And so that is from a number of aspects. One is from the dwelling. If you're in the dwelling, if you're an occupant there, you need to have the right level of sunlight. You need to have the right outlook. You need the right green space. And at the moment, there aren't qualitative standards to ensure that, but also qualitative standards about what it looks like from the street, how it looks in the neighbourhood. Again, that's not in the place. This is a key one, and I very strongly push for this. Create a Nelson Urban Design Guide. At the moment, there is no design guidance. There's a couple of things, there's Wakefield Quay and some stuff in the city, but it's very, very minor, it's out of date. We need to have proper design guidance, because otherwise there's a risk that it's just done on a site-by-site basis. Ian, you've got comments?
Yeah, you might tell people that MFE put out design guidelines that should be going with intensification. But Nelson City has decided not to include those.
Very good point, Ian. So I think that was Boffa Miskel's produced some design guidelines, and so this is as part of the national push towards intensification. There are some national intensification guidelines, but I would actually suggest that having some which are locally specific are probably quite a good move as well. And I think there's one that I found which is, I believe it was Whakatane, which is a fairly similar size to Nelson. Very, very robust design guides. And that is determining exactly this is what development should look like. This is what good quality development looks like. This is how we achieve that. And lastly, there is a urban design panel in Nelson, and that is currently being questioned by council as to whether or not that should actually exist. And there's talk of potentially chucking that out. Now, the Urban Design Panel is an entity which exists where larger development projects go to, and then they get reviewed by industry body experts, by design experts, who provide feedback and input on the design, the quality of the design. And I think that when we are pushing for quality design outcomes, that is a critical tool that we need to use. I would suggest strengthening that. I would suggest saying that development which crosses a certain threshold, and that is the number of units, the height, or the significance of the area, is obligated to go to that. And the outcomes of that, or the recommendations from the Urban Design Panel, has more weight in the resource consenting process. That is how we ensure that better quality designs are achieved.
How receptive do you think the council would be to these suggestions?
Do you want to repeat that? So yeah, sure. The question was how receptive do I think council would be to these questions, to these suggestions? Well, I pitched the idea of an urban development agency last year, and as a result, Nelson City Council and Tasman District Council each put in $75,000 to do a feasibility study. I think they're open to it. I think that there's probably been a bit of surprise at council with some of the pushback on Plan Change 29, and that has got them in a position where they're having to question what do we do? How do we respond to that? Now is the time to be trying to get some good outcomes from the process. I find it quite difficult, the engagement process with council, and I've done a lot of it, because it typically happens behind closed doors in council, then it comes out and you submit, and things don't really change. So I think now is a good time to be doing that. And that's me. There we are.
Thank you, William. So we'll just keep all the questions and comments till the end, so there's a bit to go through. So the last person to come up is Peter Olorenshaw, who actually spoke here last time, but this time actually he's talking on behalf of Nelsust, the Nelson Transport Strategy Group, Inc. And he's just talking about the fact that it's a proximity in relation to transport in Nelson. you really can't build without sort of transporting the residents as well. So he will come up with a few alternative solutions to what we're doing now. And I'll just give him a few seconds to get himself set up, and he'll be away. Now. And by the way, after that we'll have question and answers or statements from the floor, but we'll need to be gone by 2, so that'll give us about half an hour to do that. Yes?
Can I just make one comment? So we've worked extensively on intensification. There's 2 parts to Plan Change 29, and part that we haven't discussed at all, but a lady over here did mention, so they're changing sections on heritage. And from my perspective as a conservation architect of 40 years, it's a very poor change.
Right.
The lady here mentioned a significant number of heritage buildings are going to be removed from the list.
Right.
The list is incomplete. It's not following best practice throughout New Zealand. In fact, Nelson is one of the worst councils in the country looking after heritage. And people come here for the sun, but they also come here for our heritage.
Yes, that's true. Okay, so we'll just leave that for now. Maybe we talk a bit more about that later if other people have an opinion, and I'll just hand you over to Peter and Transport.
Cool. Jan, can I just mention one thing? You said in Tier 2
Oh, yes.
cities like Nelson don't need to comply with the medium density residential standards, but they do need to show where the growth is coming from.
Right.
So, Tier 2 cities like Nelson don't need to comply with the medium density residential standards as far as like Tier 1 councils do, but they do need to show where the growth can be accommodated.
Right.
So you can either argue against the population growth, or you really need to show if the growth isn't going to happen the way they say, how else could it be accommodated?
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Transport. So land transport emissions have been up 93% since 1990. You can see international aviation was up a bit, but domestic aviation pretty much flat. So 1990 was when the Kyoto Protocol came out, and that's where we should have been stopped with our emissions, but we've gone up massively since that. Car emissions actually predominate. It's not big trucks, it's actually cars. Per capita transport emissions in New Zealand are huge. You know, we're 4th worst in the OECD. And part of this is the number of cars per person. This is from Wikipedia. So there's New Zealand at 860 motor vehicles per 1,000 people overall. And there's only a few countries that are worse than us, like Monaco and San Marino, that are pretty weird. But this is Nelson. So we actually have 1-to-1 here. So we have 1 car for every man, woman and child. And at a household level, 93% of our emissions are from transport. So just to put that in another perspective, if you're worried about your climate emissions, everything else is noise other than transport at a household level. This is a hat tip to Lindsay. He's found this, that the urban form has a huge influence on your carbon emissions from transport. And these are 2 cities, they're not too different in population, Berlin and Atlanta in the US. The red is public transport routes, but also in the pie graph is the amount of people that are using public transport and active modes. and you can see the difference between Atlanta and Berlin.
The red is public transport.
Sorry, did I say it the other way around?
No, you didn't say it.
Oh, sorry. Okay. So at the top there, red's PT and active transport in the pie charts at least. I think in the map, the red is actually public transit.
Railways.
Railways, actually. Yeah. Okay. Okay, and the same thing's true in New Zealand. So this is 3 cities. I haven't got it for Nelson here, but you can see the lighter colour is the lower amount of carbon per commuter. So you can see the outlying areas always have bigger emissions. And you could say, oh, well, okay, we'll all have EVs soon, and that won't matter. But it does matter, because they'll be still spending a lot more energy, and that means we're going to have to produce that much more energy to power these vehicles. So even if it's not CO2, which it will be for a long time, it's still more energy with sprawl. And what that results in, this is Nelson CBD. And so we did this bit of a study of how much the CBD is taken up with cars, car parking and car yards. And we thought, oh yeah, it might be, it's probably as high as a quarter. Well, it's actually 44%. 44% is taken up with cars, car yards and car parking. But it didn't start off this way. Yeah. I keep sharing this at the bottom of Shelbourne Street. This is before the planners got involved, and this was the appropriate density for these places that are close into town. Completely illegal now. You can't do this under the current planning rules. But this is actually what should be happening, in my opinion. I don't know if Tim's here. But, and you had these bigger houses that were way outside the sort of, they're too high, they're too close to boundaries, too close to the road. But this is, there's nothing actually wrong with this, and this is what we should actually be doing in town. There's very few examples of good townhouses in Nelson, I think, but this is Hathaway Court. It's opposite Trailways, just off Trafalgar Street, if you know it. It's not perfect, but I don't know, I could live there. I would have thought most people could. They've all got a bit of dirt where they can grow some espaliered apples, some fruit trees, a few plucking herbs, a bit of grass to sit on. It's not actually apartment living.
You can hear your neighbours though very clearly through the wall.
Well, that surprises me. I've lived in lots of, a number of semis that have got adjoining walls and terrace houses, and we've never heard the neighbours. My brother...
Down to design.
Okay.
It can be done.
Yeah, my brother lives in Betts Apartments. They never hear anything through the walls. Okay. And this is a roof plan or aerial photo of Betts, and you can see how small these section sizes, if you like, actually are. This is just an example in Ekaroa. This is not too bad, I don't think. This is just an example in Japan where you're actually sharing have a proper shared zone where kids can play. And this is in Holland. Oops. And someone else, Lindsay, I think, showed a slide where density and heritage are not mutually incompatible. These are just, this is not my design, but this is Construct Architects. I don't know who the heck they are. But this is 2 different elevational treatments of the same plan that's on the left. The red arrows, can I do that? Yeah, the red arrows here are the entrances of what's actually a quadruplex, so it's like 4 houses in one. The bottom plan here is of the upper floors. The upper one is of the ground floor. The parking would be around the back. And just to say that the existing plan says nothing about heritage. We can say, well, the new plan does nothing about heritage. Well, neither does the existing one. So something's got to change there. So under existing user regulations, the existing plan rather, what can we do? And this is something that Lindsay and I worked on. We were challenged by the City Council, who said that partitioning an existing house was not cost effective. And so we did this example that I had on file of a house in Seymour Ave. And we partition it, well, this is a theoretical partitioning, and Lindsay costed it out at 116 grand for creating a completely new dwelling that's pretty much invisible increase in density. I know it doesn't actually transit us to where we need to go, but I've got a slide on that. I'm coming to that. And so these are some of the plans that Jan was trying to show before, but this is what you can do in the existing plan. This is under comprehensive housing development, where basically you chuck out the rule book, but you still comply with what they want, and this is complying with daylighting. This is just for a north-south section. It's slightly over with site coverage, so that would need to change, but you can actually do quite a bit. So this is 4 townhouses on one section where there was one before, and this is another one where it's only 12 metres wide, similar job. And this is the last slide that I just want to say about how we transition to like a townhouse topology. And this is the worst case scenario where you've got a section that faces east-west. So you're concerned about the southern neighbour. So up in this top row is what it might be like at the moment. And this is what you can do under current rules for that site. So what it does is still gives sunlight into that neighbour to the south. And so I've got this idea of how we could transition our existing suburbs into a townhouse suburb without blocking sun off to the southern neighbour. And that is if we change the rules to allow you to build 2 stories high up to your north boundary. So this bloke here, this person here is not getting any less sunlight. They're getting less daylight. Yep, I admit that, but they're not getting any less sunlight. And the rule would be that once you've built up to that north boundary, someone else can build up to that adjoining boundary. And so this would be the next stage where, because this one's been built like that, this one can build up to both boundaries and so on along the road. Yeah. And that's all I had. Cheers.
Okay, thank you. So I just suggest we sort of perhaps open it up to the floor if anybody wants to make any comments or questions, and to thank Tui Video and Nigel there for videoing this for everyone else that can't get here today, and also to remind you that if you do stand up and speak, you're volunteering to be videoed, and so if you don't want to be heard or outside of here, then don't do anything, just sit there. Okay, all right. Pardon?
Can we have a couple of minutes just to shop around and leave this?
Oh, right, yes. Anyone who'd like to go, by all means, yes, if you want to. There's a break now if you prefer.
I'd just like to thank the professionals for coming and talking to us today.
Yeah. So we're running out of time. We all talk more than we were supposed to. So if we just sort of keep it short and sweet, we can go from there. Yes, Dave?
To just spend a minute or two just trying to connect the dots here. In particular, when you were talking earlier on about urban design, you kept on slipping into using terms like the council. Where we are right now, because they have notified this, is we are dealing with an RMA process, which we have to make submissions to. In that context, can you reframe what you were talking about earlier in terms of how we should respond to an RMA process to achieve those outcomes?
So for anyone who missed the question, was about the specifics of the Plan Change 29 process, which is currently, as you said, it's an RMA process under the Resource Management Act. Now, there might be people here who have more familiarity with the Resource Management Act who can clarify this, but this is still a process which is being undertaken by Council. And it is councils, it's an obligation by councils to receive submissions and to evaluate those submissions and respond to those. That is part of that Resource Management Act process. So council's effectively operating within the Resource Management Act for this. So this is essentially, it's at council's discretion. Council aren't required to necessarily adopt this, but as Peter mentioned, the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, which came out in 2020, I believe, did require local councils, irrespective of tier, to have policies in place which A, allows for the required population growth, and B, has is directed towards certain policy outcomes, and some of those are related to intensification. So even though Nelson City Council isn't Tier 1, they are still required to put policies in place which would encourage intensification in certain areas. So there's, I'm not sure if that's quite answered your question, but essentially Council are operating within the Resource Management Act framework, and submissions to Council will be assessed as such. Yeah.
Okay. So nobody's yet addressed seismic risk, and Nelson is one of 4 cities in New Zealand that's built on an active fault line, and a big one. And heights and building design, and I know GNS did a really significant paper after the Kaikoura earthquake on what's safe in a seismic risk area, and that hasn't been addressed. Has anyone else seen anything about seismic risk?
Yep, you want to do it, Lindsay?
I think that's a really good point.
Could you repeat the question?
Oh, yeah, sure. The question was, nothing's been said about the seismic risk that we've got in Nelson, and we're one of a handful of places that's important to. I've actually posed that question to the council, said particularly, what about an Alpine Fault Force 8, an AF8? And they said, oh, no, we haven't considered that at all. I think it gets worse when you think about things like energy security, because one of the things that will almost certainly happen in an AF8, and the chances are pretty high of that happening over the next 30 years or so, they're around about 70%, I think, is that very likely our mains power will go down. And one of the things in the future development strategy that the councils actually chose not to do, which in my view was contrary to the law, was to consider renewable electricity generation in the region, which should have, they're actually required to consider that in the future development strategy. They specifically said we're not considering it, and stuck to their guns not to consider it. So I think that's a very valid point. This has nothing to do with the safety of the buildings, which is of course a factor in there again. We won't know what's hit us when an AF8 goes off. I think it's a 2 metre vertical shift and an 8 metre horizontal shift.
Add to that. On the question of, I guess, the buildings themselves. So seismic performance is covered by the Building Act. And the process that we're talking about, Plan Change 29, is the Resource Management Act. So they're actually 2 different bits of legislation. So there are some things that could be considered within the Resource Management Act about seismic design. However, for the most part, that is addressed through the Building Code, and the Building Code has parameters to assess risk based on seismic zone. And so that is essentially the difference between applying for a resource consent, which is done through the Resource Management Act framework, or a building consent. And building consent is dictating what you're going to build and how it's going to be built, and that needs to meet the seismic restrictions of that particular area.
Sure, but under the planning process, surely that could dictate a height restriction, what we're looking at.
Well, yes and no, but I mean, there are parts of the world, parts of New Zealand, where there's absolutely very tall buildings being built and more seismically active zones than Nelson. So yes, it's achievable. It's very expensive, but it's not a factor which is in itself determining the built outcomes. So that's more of the Building Act process. Yeah.
I guess there's a practical relationship though, isn't it? If the seismic issues are taken into account, 6-storey buildings in Nelson will be expensive, and they won't be affordable housing. They'll be high-class quality housing at, $1 million each place, and that won't be very much of a requirement, I wouldn't have thought.
Well, I think that you've hit the nail on the head there about the cost associated with building 6-storey buildings. Two things. Firstly, the increased seismic performance that is required means that they are highly unfeasible and less likely to be built. So I think that even though whether or not that's included in the planning regulations, I think there's the market will actually deliver lower buildings as a result, because it costs a lot more to go higher. The other aspect to it, which we haven't really touched too much on building heights or number of levels, but I think the feasibility of 6-storey buildings in Nelson it's not really, it doesn't stack up. When you go above 3 and potentially 4 stories, you're looking at lifts, you're looking at wind engineering, facade engineering, seismic engineering. The costs just go through the roof. There is a natural feasibility that the market is able to deliver, and I personally don't see 6 stories as being feasible at all in Nelson, at least not at this stage.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Hi, my name's Kathy Nunn and I live in Collingwood Street. I've been following very closely the council website with the frequently asked questions, and there was a letter to the editor from, I think it was John Fitcher, asking for a reply in plain language. Now, when you read the replies that are coming from the council, just about everyone says, if you don't think the rules are right, tell us what the rules should be. Now, for the average person, even just to even read Chapter 7 and understand the proposed rules, and then to suggest a different rule that will work, is a huge undertaking. And my concern is that this is the message the council is saying, with your submissions, tell us what the rules should be. But most of us simply aren't in a position to do that.
No. But we can just simply say to them, this is what we want instead. What we want and what the rules are, two very different things, yeah.
But my concern is that this is the mindset of the planners. And if we don't do that, then are they going to take any notice of what people are saying?
It is unstable ground, isn't it? Yes, I sense that too. So yes, Harry.
Hello everybody, my name's Harry. One thing that hasn't been considered and that is really important is the effect on mental health. We all know mental health is a major issue in New Zealand and also in Nelson, and there are studies that have been done in New Zealand. The higher up you live, generally the poorer outcomes on mental health. So, and that may be an exception, there's penthouse suites or fancy apartment buildings like down in Tunanui Beach. But what we're trying to build is affordable housing for people. And so basically the higher up you go, the poorer outcomes on mental health. So I think people should stress that in their submissions.
Yep, fair enough. Yes, Sarah.
Sarah Holman, sorry, I've moved around a bit. I think in that sense, and perhaps in relation to the question from the previous lady, is that, say what outcome you want. You don't necessarily have to spell out the rules, in my experience. I would just say, in relation to mental health, say we request that the council, obtains a social impact study. And people have said that already. So, put that in your submission. Or if you're concerned about daylight, say what outcome you want. You don't have to necessarily be technical to be listened to, and everything by law has to be listened to. So I wouldn't get too concerned about the detail. I would personally say, unless I have a particular interest in heritage and I am concerned about the detail, but if you're not sure, go to see a friend of the submitter, Emily Bayliss, I think her name is, ask around and also just put the outcome you want would be my advice from pretty much years in that business. So I'm not a planner, but I work in that general area. I don't know if that helps.
Thank you.
That's all right. Yeah, that's good. Anyone else? Sheila, do you want to speak?
I am a planner. I think I really thank you ever so much, Jan, and the speakers today. And Kathy's got a very good point. It's very difficult, even for me as a planner, to access the information that's been available, because it is only available through your computer at home. And quite often you want to cross-reference things. And I did my question to the website was, would it be possible to have hard copies available, plus plans showing the zoning as it is now and the changes to the zoning, because it's not just medium and high density. There's a lot of changes to the hazard rules, which are probably excellent, but it must be very hard for anyone who's affected by that to actually see what the difference is between now and what is proposed. And the answer I got on the website was it would be $633. I didn't reply, but my point was it would be very easy at the library to actually have a display that had big copies of the zoning plan as it is now and the zoning plan as it is proposed. I'm in Collingwood Street. I am in what is now a low density area, which is not going to be proposed for high, it's proposed for medium. But I have pinched one of the plans that was on display at the Trafalgar Centre, and I have gone around with a pencil, and for my own interest I can see the actual change that has occurred. And Jan and I both thought it would, if the councillors got together, they could put $50 in each and purchase a copy and ask their GIS department to print out a couple of big plans so you could actually cross-reference and see the difference. So I'm actually inclined to follow that one up myself, because I think it would be really helpful for everybody. And in terms of making submissions, I think it's really important to distinguish between commenting on the process and commenting on the analysis that backs up these changes. Now, the analysis is in what is called the Section 32 Evaluation Report. And what they have to do is look at options and then evaluate those options in terms of effectiveness and efficiency. I think effectiveness, is it going to achieve what it's setting out to achieve? Efficiency takes costs into account. Then they do a cost-benefit analysis, and then they have a risk analysis. And the risk, they've said, given the information, we consider that the risk is acceptable. And they've said that under every topic. Now, if you're looking at risk, you really have to look at two things. You have to look at the likelihood of something happening, and then you have to look at the consequences of that happening. Now, there was an economic study. I think the Section 32 evaluation is about 300 pages, and there's a whole lot of other backup appendices. The economic one is very interesting because it says that if you actually looked at the heights, the proposed and the high density and the medium density, you could provide hundreds of dwellings, and yet when they look at the population and how many people they expect, it's way down here. So the actual likelihood of suddenly getting 6-storey buildings, or even progressively 3-storey buildings, the likelihood is probably quite low. But if you look at the consequences of suddenly a very tall building, or even some medium density that breach the sunlight, or the current sunlight controls, you've actually got some quite serious consequences. Yeah. So that's the way to phrase a submission, is in terms of, has their analysis been good enough? And that was a point I made at one meeting. I think it's been inadequate, and I have suggested some things that they could do following on a little bit from what William said in terms of character analysis and how you would go about doing that. So I hope that's been a little bit helpful, and I'm happy to answer any further questions on planning matters.
No, that's fine. Yes, Nettie.
Trafalgar Centre meeting, I stood and asked the council whether they'd done a social impact assessment. There was silence. I spoke to Nick at the end of the meeting. He said, oh, well, I said, you haven't done it, it's not there, show me. I got the response, it hadn't been done. 2 planners at the library on Thursday, I said, what about the social impact assessment? Oh, it's all been done, it's done. I said, show it to me, it's there. I said, it's not there, you have not done it. I don't think they knew what a social impact assessment analysis actually was. I don't know, but they said, one of the planners said, we've done so much analysis and so much, we've got so much material, it was too much, it's too complicated, we've done too much. So, you know, take care of what you hear.
So, actually, I'm sorry, it's 2 o'clock and we have to vamoose.
One quick one.
Okay.
30 days from now, which is the day after the 14th, which we've all got a commitment for, if Nelson turned a brighter shade of blue, for example, could we invite the new candidate stage to be able to hear all us as well?
Yeah,
as the
there'd be a long queue for that, I think, yes. I'm sorry, we have to leave exactly on 2 to fit in with their schedules. Mark actually printed out copies of his speech if you'd like to have a look at it. There's some copies on the table outside there, and something else which I can't remember. From our Citizens Assembly, yes, from Lindsay. And if you could put your email on the email list, actually, if we do anything else again, I can contact you directly. Thank you for coming, everybody.